Good morning. Good morning. It's Monday, April 3rd, 10:05. I'm beginning the New Hampshire Prescription Drug Affordability Board. And I'd like to go through introductions. Let's do the ones around the table. Before I do that, I also need to recognize that Senator Rosenwald is here as an alternative. And you will be a full member because Senator Carson's not here.
Okay,
So
great.
you'll be elevated to full membership. I believe Todd's here. And the other one that needs to be elevated would be Bob Woodward, because you're here physically to be a member, even though Dr. Murphy, Representative Murphy is on. Okay, so I'll elevate you there. So we have two people we elevated from alternate to full member. Thank you for today. One round, do the introductions. My name is Gary Merchant, Chair of the New Hampshire Prescription Drug Affordability Board. I'm also a state representative for Sullivan County 6, which is Claremont and Croydon. And to my left.
Oh, that's me. Tom Sherman, former state rep, state senator, and now just a doctor on the seacoast.
Good morning, Todd Fahey. I am a member of the board and a lawyer practicing law in Concord, New Hampshire.
Bob Woodward, retired health economist from UNH.
Cindy Rosenwald, Senate District 13.
As is alternate appointee.
And on the Zoom, we have two individuals. Bill or Murphy, which one do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go. Jim Murphy, rep for Hanover and Lyme and a member of the board.
And I'm Bill Marsh, a former state rep and a retired physician.
Thank you all. So as far as a quorum, we have now 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 5 full members, so we have therefore a quorum. We'll establish that. The agenda review. I would like to take the discussion, which is the board discussion, and move that to the end, so we have ample time to work our way through that discussion and not be under time constraint. Does anyone disagree with that? Therefore, we'll move that down to the bottom. As far as the review of the minutes for the February 6th meeting, are there any concerns or questions about that?
Move that we accept the minutes.
Second.
One correction, I'm listed as a representative again, and I was no longer a representative at that time.
And I was absent, so it says that, but I won't be voting for home. Abstain.
Abstaining for it.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any more corrections people have? We have a motion by Senator Sherman, or Tom Sherman, Dr. Sherman. And also seconded by Dr. Woodward. Is there more discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? And we have one abstain. Senator Rosenwald. Thank you. MOU update. We have statutorily a requirement to have an MOU with the Department of Human Services. We're administratively attached to them, so Rob, if you could give us an update on that.
Sure. So as you may be aware, the House Finance is proposing some changes to the way the board is funded for going forward. Our current MOU reflects the current method, which is in statute, which is my understanding is that they're looking to change the funding mechanism to a general fund appropriation. So the Department of Health and Human Services is hoping to pull back a little bit, wait for that process to play out before we execute the MOU. That way, when it goes to GNC, it only has to go the one time. We don't have to amend it, and we can keep it as clean as possible.
Any questions about the MOU? Thank you. In regards to the update on emails to the entities, the manufacturers, distributors. Yes.
So the latest is that we have a registered list of about 800 that was forwarded to finance. with the HHS.
Thank you for that. And I think there are some questions that were raised by some of them. The list we had included some manufacturers that only did over-the-counter drugs. We explained to them through attestation that they didn't have to comply. Also, there's ones for medical devices, and somehow we had a list from Oregon that we try to use to make ours more robust. So we had several that replied and, qualified for these reasons. We honored that. All we said was complete the attestation, so we can close the loop on your list on the email, which was done. Legislative update, House Bill 130 and House Bill 172 have been retained by House Commerce. We also have HB 2, which is dealing with amendment by Representative Edwards in regards to a change in the source of funds, as Representative Mr. Berry said, moving it from assessment fees over to coming out of general funds. So that is what's in play right now. House Bill 2. That's where we are with that.
So I just have a question. We're coming up on, I think it's May 1st when invoices are supposed to go out statutorily. And we have had, I first was interested in this in January and whether we were moving forward with the process. But since then, we have seen, we've gone through the legislature and with HB 130, HB 172, now HB 2, that raises a question about how we are going to actually do our funding. We have the chairman and I met with OLS to review the constitutionality question that was raised as a charge from fiscal to OLS to look at the constitutionality of the fees and whether there are benefits to the different entities that are paying the fees. And Representative Marsh did a nice list of all the different benefits they get, but of course, none of this has gone to a court of law, which was pointed out at fiscal by Representative Lynn, who is also former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, kind of a handy guy to have around. So where we are right now seems to me to be kind of limbo. We have legislative limbo because there are bills pending that would change our fee structure. There's constitutional limbo. The vote from fiscal, I read the verbatim transcript, and the vote, as Representative Lynn said, fiscal can't change legislation. So the vote was to go back and look at whether legislative remedy was necessary. And that's sort of where we stand. So I was going to ask the chair, what are our options? A lot of this seems legal to me, which I'm certainly not qualified to make a decision on. And I think we have more questions right now than we have answers, and yet we have a May 1st deadline coming. So what are your thoughts?
My thought is this. My take on it is the statute's in place. We're bound to comply with the statute as written until it's changed. It may change, it may not change. I would suggest that we should ask the AG's office to provide to us a ruling. First of all, the constitutionality of it, number one, because it wasn't questioned. I think we also should talk about the waiving of fees. Can we do that collectively? Is it something that you do for one entity, or is it something we do for everybody? This is out of my bailiwick. I'm not an attorney, but I think there's a legal issue here that needs to be resolved. And I think the logical place to resolve that is with the people who are in the legal realm, which is going to be the Attorney General's office.
Yeah, absolutely.
Raise it with them, bring it back. We have a meeting on May 1st, which is going to be at the same time with the invoices. At that point in time, have a meeting with our attorney. And at that point in time, probably because it's with our attorney, it'd be attorney-client privilege. So it'd be a non-meeting meeting. And then have them help advise us what we should be doing. That's my recommendation to the board, is that we need to get legal involved, and it's really the Attorney General's office. Yes.
What is constitutional question?
The constitutional question came down to is that with the fee, the issue comes down to, in order to levy a fee, there needs to be some corresponding benefit to the person who receives the fee and the cost of the fee. The classic one would be a driver's license, could be a marriage license. You have something in return, registration for practicing law, for instance. You have something you tangible is given back to you. I believe that the way the law is written, that one of the things that under the pharmacy realm anyways, in the Board of Pharmacy, there's a requirement that anybody who's going to get a pharmacy permit has to comply with all applicable state laws.
Mhm.
So if this is state law, therefore they have to comply with it. Then it's part of the process, but I'm not an attorney to make that determination.
Okay.
And that's the part I don't know. And even though Judge Lynn, not yet. One of the things that Representative Lynn brought up also, who's also Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, if you already retired, was there is the issue of constitutionality. He doesn't disagree with that, but it really has to be defined by the court or by somebody else. Maybe we should take it to the Supreme Court, to the AG's office. I would think it's part of this is legal.
Can I ask a
Sure,
follow-up
please.
question? Has the AG ever weighed in anywhere along the way to date that there might be constitutional issues?
No, which is why I think we need to have them weigh in. Simple.
Thank you.
Any,
No, I think we should have the Attorney General's office weigh in.
of them bring it to them.
Do you want a formal motion to have the Attorney General's office?
I'd like someone to make a motion that we had asked the AG's office at this point in time to help us with the legal. I want to call it quandary that we're in, to help us advise us what are some of the things we could do. We could ask for an opinion through them about waiving the fees. We also talk about the issue about getting the constitutionality. Do they go to the Supreme Court? There's a question at that point in time, what are the options for us, Tom? Because I don't have them all.
So I'll second Representative Merchant's motion. That's all right with you.
Yeah. Is there any more discussion about it? Bring this over to the Attorney General's office.
Mr. Chairman, may I just ask for clarification?
Not public comment, Jeff. Thank you.
At the end of the meeting, you'd like to address this issue?
When we get to public comments.
We need to vote.
Yes. Okay. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, I need to do a roll call, sorry, because they have two people on the Zoom. So we'll do a roll call. Dr. Marsh. Unmute.
I vote yes.
Representative Murphy.
I vote yes.
Woodward.
Yes.
Senator Rosenwald.
Yes.
Dr. Azey.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, it's
Yes.
unanimous. Thank you. All right, and we'll tee it out for, can you talk to the AG's office for us and get this on the agenda for the May 1st meeting? And then talk about. It's gonna be a non-meeting meeting, so it'll be a meeting where we're returning, so we'll set it. Okay. In regards to the next issue on the board would be the board discussion about strategies to reduce cost. We've done a lot of work as far as starting to look at the analysis of the data and so forth. But before we get into what I call the weeds, I think I'd rather have, from the board's point of view, what are the key elements that we want to think about on how to reduce direct costs? So I asked Dr. Woodward and Dr. Azey to lead a conversation with us today with some recommendations that we can try to consider. For us to then dick around, hopefully maybe in the May meeting, I see if we find somebody to come in, maybe from another source to help guide us through the process, but that's kind of where we are today. I have two economists that we don't normally have. I wanted to pick their brains and figure out at this point in time, what do you recommend, recommendations and lead the discussion? Alphabetical. Well, good one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, yeah, I've taken a unique perspective on
Yeah.
that request, and we talked a lot, I think, Dr. Sherman brought up some concerns that he had with the data that we're using, the claims data and the answer is. And I've given that a lot of thought, and I thought about other sources of data that's in the statute, and under our autonomy to look at. And I think a big part of what the board is doing is working on price transparency, which is a more passive approach for spending reform. But I'm not sure if the board is aware of it, but the federal government, CMS, has a prescription drug data collection portal, and they have a lot of the same drug reporting parameters that the board has. But those reports come directly from the manufacturers, not through the claims data. And it may represent a more holistic and complete set of data that we might consider using for price transparency. So I kind of want to bring that up to the board and hear any feedback on that. And we're set up the insurance department now with essentially a repository for these data coming in from hires, which is the health insurance reporting system. So I wanted to make the board aware of that and see if there was any feedback, because it's very different in terms of completeness compared to the claims data. Now, whether or not we're able to stratify that by the public payer part of what the statute mandates us to look at, may be a matter of debate, but it'd be a good debate to start with.
Have you had a chance, Dr. Izzy, to look at the data elements in that database compared to what we have today?
Yes.
So is it ways to help enrich ours, or are we losing something that we have in ours by only looking at that one?
Well, yeah, whether it's fodder to merge with the claims data, depends upon it, but it's a very robust data. There's essentially 10 files, 3 of which are aligned with the reporting requirements to this board. So the top 20, it's actually the top 50 most frequently prescribed drugs, the top 50 most costly drugs, the top 50 drugs with the greatest year-to-year spending increase. Moreover, there are crosswalk files that have therapeutic class and drug type categories. So we can maybe identify specific therapeutic classes of drugs that are major drivers of cost. And one last thing, there are 2 files that include drug rebates by therapeutic class and drug rebates by the top 25 most costly drugs. So taken together, I think that that's something that we should consider at least having as, if nothing at all, as a tangential data source to add to the CHIS data, given some of the gaps in completeness and missing data in the CHIS.
On the drug rebates, is it drug specific or is it any aggregate?
It's stratified by therapeutic class. And then, so that's a variable on that, so you could get all drugs in that same file, and then it's also stratified by the 25 most costly drugs.
How does it deal with utilization? Does it pick that up?
No, there are no utilization parameters, it's reporting based, this is reported by drug manufacturers. So it's fundamentally a different source.
Right.
But that in of itself might be a robust piece of information that we can use.
Right.
To one, assess the fidelity of the same parameters in the CHIS data. And 2, to see if it might be more appropriate reporting metric to inform this board.
And that the utilization is available in CHIS, correct? So
Yeah.
we actually know not just which is most expensive by unit, but by how often it's being used. Because that's, of course, a big cost driver.
Right, and that's its primary attribute is that
So
we know in the state for those pairs what the utilization is.
Please.
do you think that we have the capacity already to do that bridge that you're sort of talking about, where we could utilize both together and
I'm
really
hoping,
increase
Dr.
the power?
Thank you.
Oh, is that the W
I'm
part?
hoping, Dr. If we could work together to create, that would be an analytic framework that we could create to help inform the board. But this is new federal guidelines, and 2022 was the first year. Compliance was spurious at best. And I think this year we'll probably see heightened compliance. To that extent, that effect might happen, but it remains to be seen.
One last question, sorry. Yeah, we are, through statute, we have the capacity to query, at least for now we do, to query the actual drug manufacturers, and I hate to be redundant, especially with people who are just trying to do business. Would this database that you're describing provide the same data that we are statutorily looking for from the manufacturers and the PBMs and at the same level?
Yeah, with regards to, I think, A and B on 126 BBA, there
Right.
are 3 notification parameters. 2 of the 3 are embedded in this prescription drug, the federal RxDC reporting requirement, as part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021. There's another one that is section C on our statute that the insurance department also gets data for through the pharmacy board, and that's the new high-cost prescription drugs. That parameter is not in the RxDC, at least yet.
But
So-
you get it.
But the insurance department gets it, and we report quarterly on a dashboard on our website. So that's another piece of the puzzle. And that's why I mentioned this under the auspice of price transparency, because I don't think there's any one thing that constitutes price transparency. It's a lot of eyes looking at a lot of different parameters that are part of the complex industry that we're here to sit about.
So is it possible in this federal set of data or in CHIS that we're able to look at the most frequently prescribed drugs and split out how long those prescriptions are for? So like if you're, unless I'm incorrect, if you're getting a controlled drug, you can't get as long a prescription. So it has to be prescribed more often.
That's more because of state law than federal law, correct? So
Okay, but so is there a way in either of these places that we can kind of factor that out so that we're not overemphasizing controlled drugs that just have to be prescribed more often to the same person?
you raised a really good point, because if we don't sort of normalize that data, what I think, right, what's being discussed is the frequency in which the prescription is written versus the quantity the patient gets over a year.
Yeah,
So one of the things that Dr. Whitman talked about before is using day supply. So
Okay.
therefore, we're not getting into the number of times it's written,
okay.
but if it's written 12 times with 30-day supply versus it being written
Four
4 times for 90
90.
days, we still normalize it over the year.
Okay, thank you.
But one of the things I'm talking about,
Just one quick question. This may be premature, but something I think that's really important. Before, I think the two of you joined the board, we talked a lot about where the gaps were and the need for an analytical framework to really address this, as was a real important part of the statute. The mandate was to get some clarity on it. Are you able, not necessarily today, but do you think you could in the future talk about where the gaps are, even when you marry these different databases?
The gaps in.
The gaps in the data. I mean, there's a lot of gap. I mean, you can't measure what you can't see. So,
I think
because that would be important. And I guess the subsidiary question is there any sort of construct by way of a bridge or otherwise we could do to start getting more clarity on where we lack it?
Yeah, and that's a work in progress, and that's what you see now at the federal level and now the state level. Efforts that they may seem duplicative at first, but I think a lot of the framework for data collection at the federal level and the state level is driven by an organization called NASHP, National Association of State Health Plans, and they created this model for prescription drug price transparency. And these data at the federal level and at the state level are somewhat reflective of that. Sans those gaps that you might be referring to, but those might exist in the future when we see what these data tell us and understand that it doesn't give us the complete picture. That's when we respond to filling those gaps.
So just to reinforce, thank you for that. So there's a relatively new tool. This one you're talking about this morning, the CMS data was not in existence until 2022. Got it. Thank you.
So what I'm hearing is that critical to a lot of work we're trying to do here, I think it's not just us, but other people as well, bring in more transparency to the marketplace. And that's critical for the marketplace to work. Without that, it's going to be difficult for the market to try to bring costs down because the transparency is not there. Are we all on the same page? So in saying that, I mean, the overarching goal is to figure out how can we get greater transparency, at least here in New Hampshire, to the New Hampshire market, so that people who are buying the drugs have more information at their disposal, to become good buyers with the public payers, because it goes back to the taxpayer. Okay,
We like to say for the market to function optimally,
yes,
never quite getting to that perfect equilibrium, but better transparency helps to create more market optimization.
because what I'm sensing sometimes when we get into this discussion is all the finger pointing. I'm not the problem. It's this way. And I'm trying to figure out where all the fingers are going.
Everywhere.
Going everywhere. So you think that somehow this is possibly can help get down to the finger pointing and figure out, okay, manufacturers blaming the wholesalers, they're blaming the KVMs, they're blaming the insurance companies, they're blaming the pharmacies, and everybody's blaming everybody else.
I have 2 teenage daughters and I just want to know where the toothpaste is and they're both pointing the fingers at each other. Let's just find the toothpaste, right? Let's find what the drug actually costs. And that's what price transparency aims to do.
So it's critical that we have that information in order to continue down that road. Is there any other thoughts about, I mean, that's dealing with the data, Dr. W.
So,
W.
with, my apologies to Dr. Aziz, we haven't had much of a chance to bounce back and forth on this, and so what's the unit of analysis of the Medicare data? That is one of the advantages of the unit of analysis of the New Hampshire Comprehensive Health Information System, NHC or CHIS, is that unit of analysis is a person, a New Hampshire citizen. I worry, and I wasn't aware, I know of the legislation talking about it, but I didn't know they had put together a data set yet. So thank you for that. But I worry that the data that's available would not be the patient, the individual. It would be the summary. It would be equivalent that the CHIS data has individual observations. They're not identified for people worried about identification stuff, but that the prescription, you can follow individual level prescription data. When we aggregate, when the Department of Health and Human Services, Andrew puts together the top 50, if those have no individual information in it. So that there's a level of information about the variability that's available with the CHIS data that I worry about Medicare. I don't know whether they're going to allow researchers access to the Part D expenditures at an individual, but I did have the not UNOS data, but the New Hampshire, the renal data set, USRDS, which was individual data. So it's possible to get Medicare data. I did have to promise my newborn son to get access to that. So that's one level of concern about the Medicare data. The second is, as I understand it, CMS really has responsibility for Medicare and Medicaid. But is the Medicaid prescriptions or any drugs going to be reported in the data set that you're talking about? I worry that that's really Part D, which is just Medicare, and the prices that Medicare pays for drugs may be quite different than the prices Medicaid pays for drugs. And if we look at the use of state expenditures in New Hampshire, New Hampshire's, excuse me for lack of details, but roughly responsible for 50% of the Medicaid expenditures in the state. And I don't know how many state employees are on Medicare. Most of the
ex-UNH employees are retired and no longer covered by state, any benefit plans. So I worry about we have a Medicare data set in the CHIS. And we've got 5 years of data going in the past, so we can look at trends. I worry about the value of the Medicare new data set being easily integrated. It might serve as a useful benchmark. I did a dissertation on Puerto Rico, and the Wall Street Journal published an article just as I turned in my first draft, saying this data set was grossly overstated. It was new jobs attributable to industrial incentives. My professor said, oops, you gotta go back and find some data that's confirmatory. And so that the Medicare data might be confirmatory and fill in some blanks, but as a basis of our analysis, I worry. So those are my questions to you. Let me respond later. Give it a chance. I have other. Let me stop. That's my response to Dr. Aziz.
Okay, Dr. Aziz.
And not my remarks.
Senator.
Well, I was just thinking about Medicare as a New Hampshire public expense, and all of the state retirees have Medicare Advantage plans. So this, the state is on the hook for some of that Medicare cost for tens of thousands of people.
I'm not an authority on that, so that certainly is.
So
possible.
I think Medicare, it's relevant. It's sort of part C though.
In Part C, it does,
But this part C,
my concern with the database, I was gonna ask this question, is that we had talked about this before, because we wanted to go into the prescription drug. PBM side of the equation, and we talked about that, which is what I call the pharmacy benefit. And it was brought to my attention, we all talk about this, that just more costs are growing faster on the medical side than on the pharmacy side. So in this database, are they collecting only Part D, Dr. Z, or are we talking about collecting it all for the medical side?
B.
Because if we're not collecting the data where the drug costs are actually going the most, and on those drugs, then may not be as helpful.
I think that distinction too is, it depends on the entities of interest, right? We have drug manufacturers submitting their data to this database, right? So that may be independent upon whether or not that drug is in the pharmacy or the medical benefit or any given plan, because that may be more a reflection of plan design, the benefit design, than it is of the drug itself.
But in the database from RxCD.
Yeah.
Or DC, does that include both sides?
So I'm not sure about that. That's a good question. I think I wanted to respond to Dr. Woodward's question about who's the representativeness of this data. There are 3 plan files, P1, P2, P3, and this is pretty granular to that end. But what's represented in there are individual and student plans, and group plans, which covers almost 80% of the commercially insured. And then also FEHB, which are federal employee health benefit plans. So at least from that taxonomy perspective, it looks very comprehensive in terms of who's in these data. Now how well we see compliance or reporting compliance, that may remain to be seen, but at least from this framework, it looks very comprehensive, and it might actually have, for example, the CHIS data doesn't have many FEHB plans in there, because their ERISA plans are not subject to reporting requirements for claims data. So that's an example of one of the gaps that I was very interested when I saw that, because that's something we don't get in CHIS data. So that we would get here. So that would be an example of a gap filler right there.
Thank you. And then you have a question before I move on to.
I'm just a little confused about the portal. Dr. Woodward was focusing on Medicare.
Hey,
I thought you were using
Oh,
Medicare
in this conversation, yeah.
Right.
Yes, yes.
and trying to stick to the applicability of data to our state payers. Does the portal just reflect the entities under CMS, which would be Medicaid and Medicare, or is it across prescription drugs more broadly?
Yeah, and TPAs and PBMs are required to report to this, and so I think that might be confusing, because I said CMS. They're the federal entity that oversees that, but that doesn't mean it's just restricted or constrained to Medicare at all. Yeah, so I think that might be a
really
misnomer of sorts.
And is
Answer
it
that question.
in the database itself, is it national data only, or do they break it down by state?
It's broken down by group plans, so I think to that extent, you could identify plans that are endogenous to the state, and cite as New Hampshire plans.
So in that was gonna be the top 50 by dollars and use and so forth by plan.
Yes, yep, and the IC number is the identifier, yeah, so parameter, an identifier that you could identify what plan it is.
So I think what I'm hearing is the importance of bringing, again, more transparency on pricing for the board to understand how things are working, and trying to, at that point in time, where we can, is to optimize the market in order to help. Again, I'm thinking about the buyers, if we're having public payers, to educate the public payers how they become better buyers. That's the way to get there, at least one of the ways to get there is through greater pricing transparency and better understanding of how the market works with the pricing structure. And at that point in time, hopefully, by our educating them and helping people understand it, we can bring down overall cost because people become better buyers. So that kind of,
Yeah, price transparency is complex. There are supply side effects and demand side effects. So supply side effects are examples of producers behaving differently because they know they're accountable for their prices, whether their prices are accurately reported, or even if they're not, just the fact that it's called the sentinel effect, the fact that there's accountability and there's eyes on their business behaviors is oftentimes market reform and conduct reform in of itself. Then there's demand side effects where you have consumers behaving differently because they're now made aware of an array of different prices for that same product that they might be seeking. So they may be motivated to be more price sensitive, if you will. So I think that's an important understanding for, how price transparency works. It's not just by one effect or one lens. It's across the entire market, supply side, demand side, and then market wide. And so when you start getting into talking about the market wide response, that's more of a long run response. And it's important to not misinterpret what long run means. It's not defined by a period of time, rather a size of effect. How long does it take for people to start being aware that they can price shop and there's cheaper price alternatives? How long does it take for producers to be aware that, hey, people are looking at their prices? We don't want to be the highest price actor on the market. We should lower our price now.
so it brings me into one of the things back to the demand side, and I don't know how we can probably try to accelerate this. This gets back into the issue mostly on the medical side, that there are a lot of drugs today that have sense of generic as biosimilars. So how do we somehow look at the market and saying, is the uptake of the biosimilars fast enough and rapid enough? Can we somehow expedite that? Because if we can get the market and the people at that point in time, the buyers, to understand that the use of a biosimilar, which is sometimes half the price, if we're seeing low uptake on it, can we find a way to maybe to accelerate that? Any thoughts on that?
I don't have a thought, I have a question.
Yeah,
But
sure.
I'll defer my question until they answer the thought.
That's a complex thought. It's a good thought. I think price transparency, I mean, I was tempted to talk about how quickly we can start getting prices up. At the insurance department, you know, we have the New Hampshire health costs site, that's a price transparency manifestation, if you will, and right now, we don't have prescription drugs up there, but by this July, we're planning to have these 3 parameters, the top 50 most costly, frequently prescribed, and steepest increase in price drugs up there, in addition to our new high-cost prescription drugs. So that's, you know, that's an example of fast movement towards more price sensitivity or more price awareness for our consumers. The more robust we can be with that approach, the sooner we can start having downward pressure on prices in the entire market.
So, thank you. When you start reporting that in July, are you looking, is that gonna be for the full risk regulated in the winter market, or are you getting it from Chiz or from?
Yeah, I modeled for our contractor to do this work for us. I modeled it flexibly we were initially planning to use the Chiz, but if this data in the CMS portal is robust enough, I think we might be tempted to use that because it's representative of 2 large segments of plans that we actually don't currently get in the Chiz. And so that would be, if it's more representative, we would defer to this. And it's one of the advantages of having even more data is that you can assess its validity and its fidelity and choose what's the best reporting metric for that.
So if we were successful in developing a very robust framework that may not exist yet, that actually could accrue not only to public payers, but also to the entities we're regulating, because they'd have a glimpse into the market they may not otherwise have. Is that fair?
Yeah, the effect of price transparency isn't limited to only those who are reporting or those who are, we are reporting to the public. It's generally the long run effect is market wide. So this benefits all players, all actors.
Thank you.
Any questions? One of the other things I thought about is trying to find a way to accelerate the adoption, if you will, of biosimilars, because in that space, it's like the old days with tablets and capsules, we had generics. We had a lot of laws to help open up that opportunity for people could take generics versus the brand names. And it's worked very well. I think we've seen the price of a lot of the small molecules, if you will, come down dramatically. But we're not seeing the same on the biosimilars, which is what they call protein. This not get into the pharmacology of it, but it's a different market. But I think if we can find a way to talk about not so much in the data, because I think it's nice to look at data, but data is always what happened. It's not what we're trying to go forward with. It's always in a rear view mirror, but it can help us try to figure out where you want to drive the car forward. But the other thing too is that I don't know whether we can consider this, but with all the public payers, are they all using the same PBM? So why are they using one PBM? Why do we all consolidate to one PBM?
I tried, if I may, back like more than 10 years ago, to get the New Hampshire State Employee Health Plans and Medicaid to work together, and they were like, oh, we contract on different time periods, we have different formularies, the length of our contracts are different, and no, just no.
Okay,
And
that's
this was, well, let's say it was before 2010.
so is it. That's 12 years ago. Is it time to revisit? I'm not just thinking about Medicaid.
Maybe.
But the question that come down to is
Maybe.
you got cities, counties, school districts. I mean, if everybody's on all these different, we're divided amongst ourselves and not united. So again, the sheer purchasing power, if we all come together and create a formula and so forth, can we actually benefit collectively from it?
Well, that may be one of the strategies that we recommend. I just want to make sure that when Todd says,
Yeah.
we regulate nothing
Nothing.
here. I just want to make it clear that No, that
He does.
PDAB, yeah, he does, but PDAB is not a regulatory body, it's a strategy.
I
body.
apologize for that choice of language.
I just get nervous about when we use the word price instead of cost and regulation.
Set advice.
So
Fair point.
if I could
Yes,
ask,
go ahead.
so I'm just wondering if it would be helpful to talk to them or have the public payers, if they're willing to come by and talk to us about the challenges they're facing. You know, especially on prescription drug pricing and what the current,
Yeah,
you've had more experience
Well,
than that.
I think it's gotten more complicated as we've gone to managed care from Medicaid. Because those drugs are all wrapped up in the managed care contracts now. So back when I was trying to do this, Medicaid was all fee for service. So I thought this would be a good idea. And it just wasn't.
Good.
I had a student who argued that Medicaid and disability should be using the same definition of disability. And there are two offices within the state investigated the issue and all fell through with their arms up in the air. There's not a chance of the disability definition being the same in both cases. So we have some embodied
Yeah.
Bureaucrats who are reluctant to give up their authority and are very good at justifying why their authority shouldn't be given up.
Insane.
Legislated.
Well, I was gonna say, that's the other thing, if you legislative, but part of it, I'd rather use the carrot than the stick. But in looking at that. We have two colleges, universities, if you will, in the state of New Hampshire. One's Whittemore Business School, and the other one's Tuck. I mean, I remember when I went through Whittemore, we were always looking for projects. Is this something we could key up and maybe with your contacts within UNH and ask somebody within the School of Business as a project for them to look at this?
I would be a willing and supportive advocate of that kind of issue, yeah.
I mean, or the same thing up to Tuck. I mean, they're always looking for projects because that's one of the things they have to do before they can obviously articulate. But
My turn?
yeah, please.
So thank you very much. For the opportunity, a couple of contexts before I talk about specific recommendations. One, we need always to recognize that prescription drugs are about 10% of healthcare expenditures. And that lowering the cost of prescription drugs may well impact the cost of other activities. In many cases, prescription drugs really save money for the state, even though they are more expensive. That's actually how I got into the business of kidney transplantations. Also, and I'm not going to do it because there's legislative at the national level language that prohibits the discussion about quality adjusted life years. That is something economists like to maximize. That is the cost. We want to minimize the cost per quality adjusted life year. Measuring those is a pain in the neck. There's a lot of disagreement. It changes over time. So I'm going to drop that issue. But we need to have in the back of our mind that what we're really talking about is improving people's lives, not just drug purchases or drug expenditures. A second context that we need to keep in mind as we're talking is that the US sort of approach to the pharmaceutical industry basically sanctifies profit maximization. That is, the drug industry, pharma in general, and even the prescription benefit managers are focused on their profits, not on measure of quality adjusted life years delivered by the drugs. Indeed, the patent gives them 17 or 20 years of pure monopoly power. They can charge any price they want. And the sanctification has extended to the Affordable Care Act, which explicitly prohibits Medicare from negotiating on prices. That has changed by the more recent what is it?
Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah,
Inflation Reduction Act.
yeah, Inflation Reduction Act, I keep thinking IRA. Which is now allowing Medicare to designate certain drugs for which they can negotiate. And interestingly enough, the regulation that usually requires 90 days of notification, that 90 days has been waived. So they're moving on kind of a fast track to get that negotiation going. With that in the back, one other, that the pharmaceutical industry in general is kind of super good at gaming the system. We have just seen in the New York Times an article talking about the fact that when California responded to the high cost of insulin by contracting, I think $100 million or some such number with Civica, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, to produce two types of insulin competitive with that which is in the market. The three companies have agreed to lower their price that they charge in the market by 60%. Surprise, surprise, surprise. The pharmaceutical industry has done an excellent job of gaming the system. So there's now doubt about whether Civica will be able to follow through given this threat of a 60% reduction in price. That's background. My approach, my suggestion is to understand that we need to have a bimodal kind of approach. One, there are lots of us, not me, that know a great deal about the pharmaceutical industry and can make suggestions about drugs that they're pretty sure can be produced cheaply, but are very expensive. But we need to recognize that the brand name drugs are protected by a patent, and that it's, so we need to focus on things that are coming off of the brand name. We really have no, other than just whining about high prices, ability to make any cogent argument that the prices should be reduced on something that's still a brand name and under patent. So generics and biosimilars need to be the question. So those of us who are actually in the field and writing prescriptions, it can make some suggestions. The question is, what can the data people provide? As Representative Merchant has pointed out, that it's difficult to drive a car by looking in the rear view mirror all the time. You do need to look ahead. But this combination of awareness from the industry about what's going on with some verification of what they think to be true in the data is, I think, particularly productive. In particular, I've mentioned not aware of the new, not just Medicare, but CMS data set. But I have been playing around with the CHIS data set. And thanks to our friends at HHS, have now 5 years of Medicaid, just Medicaid data with individual of the top 50 drugs. I don't have any individual data, it's all summary. The top 50 expenditures, the top 50 in a cost per day, and the top 50 in the number of days prescribed during the year. And I can now report, not completely authoritatively because the data provided needs to be amplified a little bit, that the among the top 50, there are about 15 that are there because of utilization and 5 that are there because of the cost per day's dose. That's not a, that doesn't put the nail in the coffin, but it is, I think, indicative. And I am looking forward to being able to
look at, I was thinking of doing it as a 5-year, a 5-year change. To try and identify why the 5-year change increases were sufficiently, or was it mostly because of increase in utilization? Or was it mostly because of the price? I'm expecting that the most expensive in terms of expenditure drugs in 2022, which is the last year we had reports, will be a different set than the most expensive in 2017, the last year we have. And that change will, as we look at the change, that 5-year change, many of the drugs that are now most expensive will be new drugs on patent. And therefore, there's not much we're going to be able to argue. With the drug companies can argue that they under the patent law can charge anything they want. Yes.
Wouldn't that be, just having prescribed a bunch of biologics, which are super expensive, and also hepatitis C drugs, which, $1,000 a pill. Wouldn't that be the kind of focus if you were looking at strategy of thinking about biosimilars? Where, yeah, the new glitzy drug is out, but the incremental benefit across the board is exceptionally low because it's a biosimilar that does the same job. And so the strategy might be educating providers on prescribing. In other words, when something comes out, it's new, it's on patent, it's really expensive. Is it really necessary? Is the benefit really worth the additional cost? If there's no cost to the patient and the benefit is minimal, but slightly better, maybe it's once a day rather than twice a day or something like that. Do we talk about cost, that strategy? In other words, the sense I got from you was that this is something that we're just not going to be able to tackle, but I'm wondering if that might be where Representative Merchant's thoughts.
If I could follow up on that a little bit. One of the things that we could do is, again, is make recommendations of what's the fair price. And then at that point in time, not saying they can do what they want. All we're saying is based upon your example here, if there's 2 drugs that are basically comparable to each other therapeutically, and one is significantly lower because it's now available biosimilar, is just pointing it out to people. There's a huge differential in the price, and therefore it's gonna be an impact of the cost.
Right. So I guess just following up on what you're saying and trying to get away from the word price. If the cost to the state is X for one drug and 2X for another drug, and they're both attacking the same diagnosis and they have fairly equivalent efficacy, then you could look at cost per diagnosis for standard treatment. So the recommendations are not saying you should be doing this drug or getting into, but saying, there's a reasonable price point here, not price, cost point. There's a reasonable cost to the state for this. There may be outlier issues that require that. And a good example of that is there's a biologic for Crohn's and ulcerative colitis that actually spares any liver toxicity. And so in patients who have co-occurring liver disease, we want that drug, but it's still on patent. So we make a huge battle to get that drug through both Medicare, Medicaid, and the commercial payers, because for those rare patients, it's critical. And sometimes, believe it or not, we lose, especially with commercial carriers. So it's there are those exceptions, but it would be interesting to look at a strategy. Strategy could even be looking at what is a reasonable cost for a drug or a diagnosis. that is typically effective.
So I agree that we need to be focusing on the diagnosis. And as we have talked about biosimilars, I have been basically presuming, and I'm showing my lack of medical training, that a biosimilar is a different way of saying generic. And if, so I yeah, I understand what you're saying. In my mind, I've bifurcated generics and biosimilars to one. What you just described is a situation where there is a drug that's designed for colitis and Crohn's disease that is not, doesn't have an adverse effect on liver.
Right.
A side effect, and that makes that justified. That's not quite the same issue as saying there's insulin A and insulin B, and this is a delivery mechanism that is the newest delivery mechanism versus something that is a pure generic. And why do we really need the fancy delivery mechanism for the insulin?
Right, just to answer your biosimilar question, when we first were dealing with hepatitis C with drugs that were highly effective, the first one came out, it was $90,000 for a 90-day supply. The second one came out, it was half that.
Right.
They were both on patent, they were biosimilar. So no generics were available, but one was half the cost.
Right.
So that's where the cost that we all switched and Medicaid switched to the state to the one that was much less expensive, but they were still on patent.
So going back to where I started, which was that I think the recommendation is to take expertise and then look at the data. In the particular, one of the things I've done to the CHIS data set for the 50 is to put a diagnosis. You know, this drug is related to this diagnosis. I'm an economist doing it on my, with the expertise of Google. But I can sort now by diabetes, for example, and look at the differences. And I think that will be a source of information. Not that I will make a medical recommendation, but I can ask a medical question. Are these really similar drugs? One of the difficulties in the generic versus brand name drug, for example, with the statins, there are different side effects perceived. I've got a friend who was battling his insurance big time because he wasn't able to get the brand name generic that he wanted, a brand name statin drug that he wanted because of its high cost when there are lots of other statins. So it's not a black and white issue. It really depends on having medical consultation on the one hand. On the other hand, the pairing of the actual knowledge of the pharmaceutical industry with the data analysis has the potential to identify and ask questions. The data has an option to identify and ask questions of the doctor. The doctor can ask questions, or the pharmacist ask questions of the data and identify knowledge. This gets back to the knowledge areas where it seems strange that we're spending so much money when you have cheaper or equally effective alternatives.
And that, I think, is the root of what we're trying to get to. Is what's the barrier for adoption? If the drugs are out there and they do work, then can we identify what the barriers are for greater adoption? Is it, I don't know where it is. Is it because of reimbursement issues that are going on, because of the way we set up our reimbursement policies, which we have some control over? Is it because of prior authorizations that move things along with, what's interfering with the greater adoption of lower cost drugs? That I don't understand, because we know that
I don't mean to be glib or a smart ass, Have you watched TV recently in the news?
The advertising,
One of my third general contexts and
Right.
is that the pharmaceutical industry is good. They know what advertising, who they're advertising to, and they know how to sell drugs.
I totally agree with you. The question is gonna be, how do we combat, or at least try to combat some of that? It comes back to, I hate to say it, but the person sitting to my left and then his peers control things with the stroke of a pen. It's the prescribing. So you're right about the physician getting hammered by the patient coming in, asking for certain things, but I don't know within the database if we can identify again what I call prescribers that are willing to have early adopters versus, that's what I'm trying to get to is what are the barriers to that with the barriers for getting more people to, is it prior authorization to cause a problem? I think in somewhere along the way, if we know that there's this in the marketplace and we can get to a generic Remicade and we're not seeing in the database, then I would ask the question, why? Because if
Well, I think marketing is only one part of it, and that's part of our job is to sort it out, because part of it is all the rebates and all the other incentives that are out there. And what's happening between pharmaceuticals, insurance carriers, and in this case, state payer administrators and the PBMs. And I don't think we understand that component. We all, when we watch the news, we see the marketing and it's powerful. But what we actually can make recommendations on, and I really like this thought of rather, in medicine, we call it standard of practice. And so I just called it standard of cost based on diagnosis. So what should the cost, what would be a reasonable cost in the average patient coming in with this diagnosis in the state system? And what are the barriers to achieving that cost? Some of the barriers are going to be these exceptions, like the one I talked about with liver disease. That's going to be a barrier, and that's a perfectly defensible barrier. But what are the other barriers that we don't understand? And some of it is just the demanding patient, but the patient can come in and demand the latest, greatest drug. If their carrier doesn't have it on their formulary, they're not going to get it. So formularies are an important part of this. So that interrelationship that helps us understand what would be that standard cost. I think would be really valuable, but just one of us.
I agree.
But what I like about that is basically instead of trying to get into what I call the weeds, it's getting into trying to figure out what the cost is per drug, is looking at saying, what's the cost to the payer to treat the disease?
Right.
Which makes a lot of sense. And we could go back into it. I don't know if there's a way within the database to look at the diagnostic codes and saying, which ones are the most costly. And then at that point in time, identify what they are and figure out what drugs are being used. Because if we can look at those costs on that 25 highest diagnostic codes and look at the drugs that are being utilized within it, and we can figure out how to move it from one to the other.
Well, I think this is where the combination of Dr. Aziz's database, it's now named for you, and the CMS database and the CHIS database. What are your thoughts on it?
What you said earlier, we heard a lot in the last 10 minutes, but in a few different directions. But Dr. Sherman, what we said earlier about this incremental cost-effective ratio, to me, that's the direction that prescription drug price reform should go in. Now, it's a complex direction, and we don't even have an internal infrastructure in this state to measure that, but there are private entities. ICER in Cambridge, Massachusetts actually measures that, and it's a double entendre in a way. ICER, which is the Institute of Cost Effectiveness Research, But one of the key metrics is also, unfortunately, has the acronym of ISO, which is incremental cost-effective ratio, which seeks to identify a more cost-effective therapeutic approach. So you look at a standard of care and this new prospective therapy and measure the cost efficacy of the two. And if the second one's more cost-effective, then it becomes adopted as maybe prospectively the new standard of care, or maybe from the perspective of our carrier on tier one in their formulary, and then any less cost-effective approach may fall somewhere else, maybe less preferred in a formulary. That incremental cost-effective ratio seems like the direction any prescription drug price reform endeavors should go, versus just arbitrary cost, or that's capricious at best to just identify a drug based on just its arbitrary cost. There are some expensive drugs that, you know, cure wrinkles in your face, but there are some expensive drugs that they compete with that save lives or add years to lives or add quality to life. And they shouldn't be treated similarly just because they fall on the same plane of price. And until we have a cost-effective measure, we'll never know that. We'll just arbitrarily identify expensive drugs just because of the absolute cost. The relative cost is really the key feature. And there are private, not-for-profit private institutes in this country that are currently doing great work. And in other countries, there are government-sponsored regulatory bodies that really are the barriers for entry for new drugs that use those same measures to get drugs approved. And that's probably not what I would ever suggest for this great country, but a hybrid approach that looks at not just the cost, but the cost utility, how much quality of life or how curative, you mentioned the word curative a few meetings back for this hepatitis drug. When it's curative, it's worth the money.
Right.
And so that resonated with me when you mentioned the incremental cost of a new therapy.
So one of the things we talked about is they just sort of touched upon it briefly, Dr. Wood. When you talk about cost of whom? You know, there's the cost of the payer, every time you move it down the line, previous person becomes a cost to me. So if you go from the manufacturer, the wholesale, the PBM, the insurance company, and ultimately to the patient. And what I've seen is that there is a high abandonment rate by patients when the cost gets too high. What I don't know is what impact is that having here in the state of New Hampshire? Because the patient decided not to pay for the drug because it didn't have the resources to pay for it. Are they conversely not getting what are called therapeutic failures that didn't take the drug? What's the consequence to it? Are we seeing higher medical costs because the cost of the patient's gone up so much? So even though we're saving money, quote, on the drug, because no one bought it, but because no one bought it, are we seeing greater medical costs? Is there any way to kind of, I mean, think of some of the higher cost drugs when you get into a pharmacy. When to give you an example, something happened one time when we changed the policy and the patient came in at the beginning of the year and asked the question for the drug. And she said what her copay was. It was $19.95. She took out a $20 bill, seriously. And she paid for her copay. I said, no, it's $1,995. She goes, thank you. I walked away. What happened was the medical center quickly learned that because of that change, the plan design, what we're seeing was this went down by, I don't know, 10%, these numbers now, but this was going up by 20%. So within 3 months, they changed it. So I don't know whether that's good. How does that play into what we're doing? Because cost, to your point, it's just the drug cost, but if we're seeing additional costs go up in other parts of the healthcare system, are really going in the right direction. Can we answer that question? Can we even begin to think about it?
That's where the complex field of cost utility in drug research comes in. And it's, again, I think I agree with Dr. Woodward in that it's spurious and it's oftentimes discriminatory, even at best, these qualities. But that seeks to answer some of those questions. Euphemistically, I use the Botox analogy. Botox is very expensive, but it doesn't save lives. But in that competes with cost because there's one pool of money that we all share in this world, And it competes with costs of anti-cancer drugs and autoimmune drugs and things like that. And so we're left making difficult choices and decisions on what should we pay for and what shouldn't we. We want to make sure we base those decisions on meritorious data and data that has a lot of clinical merit. And so not just economic factors like price.
One of the things I would hope to be able to do in a longer term is to integrate with the CHIS data, diagnostic information of one sort or another. I've done a really rough cut of putting diseases which each drug is at the first cut used to treat onto the top 50 that we now have. And it would be possible to sort by that. So we can track the expense of, let's say, diabetes, treating diabetes with pharmaceuticals. And my hope is that we will be able to do something similar to that with a larger CHIS data set over time. That is, we might compare the cost of treating diabetes with pharmaceuticals in 2020 or 17 with 2022. Both the overall cost and the drug costs, to give some kind of sense of whether the expensive insulins were useful. There are cases where you can make a really strong case and actually the value of immunosuppression medications. The value of immunosuppression medications in saving the life of the kidney transplant is where I made a case, and actually Medicare has now decided to insure immunosuppression medications for life, as opposed to their initial no immunosuppression, 1 year, then 3 years, then 5 years. It was a tooth and claw sort of battle to get them to do it to life, because in the zip codes with low incomes, the graft survival or graft failure was much greater on the low income areas. And that happened in a very predictable way as they moved out. The difficulty, we need something like that for diabetes. That is, what is the outcome? Death, we can look at simple things, death, hospitalization rates. But the number we choose for the quality adjusted life year on diet, let's say, dialysis versus transplantation, there are different numbers. I'm totally supportive in this. I actually spent most of my career playing around with incremental cost effectiveness ratios, teaching his students that were. So I'm totally supportive of the issue, but we need to keep that kind of in the back of our mind. But I'm worried that we won't be able to come up with something that is universally agreed to. All we can do, I think, is look at what the authorities in the field think are interesting issues and then support that with data, or find some interesting questions in the data that need to be.
Thank you. Representative Murphy, you have a hand up. Sorry for the delay.
No worries. I was just listening. And I just had a couple thoughts, and as I look at the charge in the statute that we have, the 3 reporting data points that we have are the most highly frequently prescribed drug, but then the second 2 are really the 25 costliest drugs and the 25 drugs that year over year go up in cost as well. And then I was listening to the discussion about qualities, and we did a lot of quality work at Dartmouth in the orthopedic surgery department. And it's actually a very powerful tool. And the reason I bring it up is because if we're going to look at strategies to reduce costs, I guess my question to myself and to the committee is, are we going to look specifically at just cost alone? Because it could be for I wouldn't say a frivolous drug or an intervention, but it could be very costly, but with really little potential benefit. Actually, in the surgical literature, the two highest of all surgeries performed, the two highest surgeries that in the quality measures are total hips and total knees, because they actually improve not only length of life, but quality of life. So qualities is actually a measure of both quality and length of life going forward. So it's a very powerful tool. And I think the reason that would be important is if we use qualities to determine a cost utility analysis, that's a tool that's actually used, as Dr. Woodward and others would know, in a cost effectiveness analysis. And as a result of that, you can really speak to whomever we have to report our findings to say, this is the most costly drug, but it has the highest quality associated with it. Now, I don't know really how easy or difficult it would be to do a quality analysis on drugs. I think it's relatively easy, relatively speaking, for surgical procedures, because it's an episodic, event that you can measure. Qualities with drug have a lot of other interactions. So I'm not really sure how we would measure it, but it would certainly give an incredible amount of credibility to have cost. If our focus, 2/3 of our charges are related to cost, if they are to be, if the recommendations that come out of the committee are to be implemented and respected, I think having something of that nature, and I think I heard it be mentioned that, qualities are actually a very strong argument when you are trying to rein in costs or basically support a costly or, type of, intervention, whether it's drugs or surgery. So I'm not sure I know how easy or hard it would be to do quality type work on medications, but it certainly, I think, would be a powerful tool going forward. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. I do totally agree that we can't lose sight of the quality, lose sight of the impact of the patient. I mean, that's ultimately what we're trying to get to. One of the other things that talking about this, about the patient and so forth, I've come across a couple of articles that talked about drug waste. And it doesn't really deal with your question about quality, President Murphy, but it gets back into, as we go down the road and looking at drug utilization, it's somewhere between 3 to 7% of the drugs in this country they never get utilized. They're bought, but never they sit on a shelf somewhere. I can again speak from my own experience at the medical center, where we had patients, I don't know maybe what you have for your experience as well, Dr. Sherman, but things would come into the medical center because it was supposed to be less expensive. And I'll give you an example of something that happened to us. We had a very effective hemophilia program to treat hemophilias. And we took a lot of time and effort with the nursing staff to be sure that the smallest vial of the factor was sent to the patient. It's so expensive per unit. It's time consuming. So what happened was another person came along and said, well, we can sell you the factor per unit. We'll reduce your cost by 10% per unit. Sounds great. What happened was they were no longer trying to get down to the smallest vial size because they won't take the time. So instead of sending something with very little waste in it, they're sending larger vials because that's how they're making the money. But it took a while for people to catch on to what was happening because they were paying for a lot of drug that never get utilized. Why I bring this to people's attention is, if you look at the whole pharmacy supply chain, the only time the chain makes any money, whether it's the manufacturer, the distributor, the BBM, pharmacy, wholesaler, anyone, is if the drug's bought. So if there's a way for us to find a solution, they don't have them today, but how much are we wasting? And it's not just a question of wasting it, it goes back into landfills. We have to dispose of it. So that's another area out there looking at and saying, is anyone looking at waste? And Botox, by the way, is a classic one, because back to the manufacturer, that they sent it in certain vial sizes. Specifically, they don't want you, it's single use only. The reality is you can actually use it multiple times if you do it correctly. But the pushback is say it's a single use vial. So you got 50 units in it, but you're only gonna take out 10, so you throw 40 away. It's a very expensive product. Not saying that's the answer and the only thing to think about, but
We're just sort of translating that into a possible recommendation down the road. If we look at that, the actual packaging.
Mhm.
You know, if it could be a recommendation to the state. Administrator, state plan administrators, don't look at just the cost of a package. Look at that size as, so you may get 10. Each one slightly more expensive than if you got one that had 10, but lo and behold, you know, you're wasting 9 milligrams of out of the 10 for each of those. So you're actually increasing the total cost with the state plan. So I think in there could well be a recommendation as look at not just the package cost, but the utilization of that by milligram amount or however it's whatever the unit is. That would be really interesting, especially with some, my wife's a dermatologist and Botox is, she would waste it on me. So if it's 4 months, I wouldn't be able to frown and fortunately, she's retired, so I'm safe with that. But that's what happens with waste is that.
a lot of waste. The other thing too, which happens periodically, and again, it's back into working with the diagnosis and looking where the cost is, with drugs with it. Could we find a way to, what they call, round up the full package size? Because a lot of studies today are done through a milligram per kilogram.
Right.
The reality is with Remicade, not exactly where you're coming down with this, but I would make the argument sometimes you can round up the next vial size without really, or down, without really causing therapeutic problem with the patient. But it's back to educating the prescribers and how to do that. Or maybe it's back to reimbursement. We only reimburse for full vials. We don't reimburse for partial vials. I'm not saying it's the answer, but that's kind of the thought process.
Sounds sensible.
Okay. All right, so I think we're wrapping up here. It's been a great discussion. One of the things we talked about was the database. Dr. Z, are you going to be able to follow through with that and find out what we have for CMS and what they're collecting versus our database? I think you can start doing that work. We can come back in May and talk about a report, how we're doing and the value, trying to pull them together.
Yeah, I'll send a couple of links to the group and a couple of screenshots of the folder that they have, and it lists all the files, so you'll see some similarity with what we require for reporting, and that considers to build on our advance our knowledge and understanding of that database, and then I'm happy to report on that next meeting where they're at.
Can you do one other, can you look at our statute that guides us and see if this database possibly combined with CHIS would make the reporting requirement unnecessary for, and we have this reporting requirement, which there's 2 reasons to think about this. Number one is that if we don't need to put pharmaceuticals through an exercise that they're already doing somewhere else, we shouldn't. And second of all, we have very strict, super strict confidentiality requirements, which using an existing database would not put the board or the state in any liability. Whereas if there's a breach of data that we really didn't need in the first place, because it's already available. But do you get what I'm talking about? So it would be really interesting to know if we can find somewhere where the data that we're looking for already exists. And then not have to go through that exercise, not have to put the pharmaceuticals and PBMs and others at that scene.
Yes, I will, and I appreciate that question. I'll ask, at the same time, ask the board to consider that these data, although they seem similar, almost identical, they're reported by two different entities. The CHIS data is from the medical claim and the pharmacy claims that come into the state of New Hampshire. Not all covered lives come in through the CHIS data, whereas the CMS, the RxDC data is sent in through TPAs and drug manufacturers through a federal statutory requirement. And so those are two different sources of the data.
Right.
And that's it. And I think they're both, it's a good question. And I don't have the answer to that. I think the board collectively will have to get to that answer, which one's sufficient enough. And I think sometimes with data, you do descriptive analyses to see, check out its distribution and analyze it for its fidelity and see, assess its representativeness. And then we'll have to make an educated decision to see which one more closely allows us to meet our statutory responsibility.
Right. Very well said.
The other one I have, Dr. Woodward, if you could speak to someone down to Whittemore. To maybe do, not to analyze the PBMs per se, but it'd be interesting to find out across the state, how many different PBMs we have in public care space.
So it's a PBM analysis.
Yeah. You know,
To the extent possible.
correct, so looking at which PBMs they have, which ones they're using, and possibly within that, are they using the same formulary, because that's what drives a lot of it. It's just getting more of a market research done to help us understand out in the marketplace amongst public payers, is there any utility in trying to bring us together? If we're all there now, then there's not much utility. I don't think we're going to, but it'd be nice to have that data to say, you know, within school districts, the counties, the cities, state, universities, I mean, how many different PBMs are we utilizing
And Medicaid.
in Medicaid? It'd be nice to know. So I know with Medicaid, I was at the meeting with fiscal, which caught my attention. Medicaid now, I think on an annual basis, spending about $290 million
On drugs.
on drugs. And right now it's about 19% of the budget. And growing. But I think what I'm trying to get to is that how do we share amongst ourselves the resources, not just the buying power, but the knowledge that comes with it?
Just quick clarify.
Yeah.
Medicaid is 19% of the state's budget.
No,
Prescription drugs are 19% of the Medicaid budget. Prescriptions are 90.
$290 million that Medicaid spending in healthcare, 19% is coming from drugs.
Gotcha.
That's right, so two. Right. And it's growing. The other one I heard is an issue about biosimilars and what are the barriers that we can try to understand. How do we enhance greater adoption of them? Either through reimbursement on our side to the payers, how you pay for it. Yeah, you won't pay for this one, you pay for that one. I mean, those are the things we're trying to understand is what's prohibiting the marketplace to having a greater adoption of biosimilars
Or lower.
or lower
drugs.
costs, right?
Clarification. Do the drug formularies apply to biosimilars?
I don't know. That's a question when you do the market research, you know.
Well, there are on drug formularies, there's a biosimilar that's less expensive, at least in the commercial space. My experience has been that they're going to go with the less expensive biosimilar, whether or not it's generic, whether it's generic or they can get it for less. That's the part that I would like to understand is how are they optimizing the cost to them? And how can we all optimize that cost? Because, you know, you may have something that's on your television during the news that's not available on your formulary, but there's something that works just as well on your formulary that they're getting for a lot less, but it's still on patent. And how do they do that? Because that would be very, I think it'd be informative for us in lowering state costs.
Well, what we'd really like the Paul School to come up with is a description of the different PBMs that are in the state and the formularies they use.
Public payers,
And why?
For public.
public payers only. We're not getting, don't worry about the commercial side. It's only for public payers.
Is it going to be, I don't know whether the PBMs had different formularies
Yes.
for the Medicaid than they have for commercial insurance? I don't know the answer to that.
We have to
I think
find
that's
out.
it, gotta find out. Are they using the same formula or are they using different formulas? And that's a question to ask them when you, the market.
And then there
research.
was also sort of a possible goal would be to determine standard of cost is what I call it, by disease or diagnosis.
That's
In other
separate from
words-
the formularies.
No, that would be from all available drugs for a disease. What is, you're gonna get a range. What is the standard
So
cost?
that's retrospective, not prospective. The formula
Well,
is
you
the
can't do it,
prospective.
right,
The retrospective would be looking at the data. Is there a range of costs?
well, we know there's a range of costs, so the question is. If you know that there's a drug available that can treat that disease. In 95% of cases. And there's another drug available that's twice as expensive. That has about the same efficacy. What is the, and a lot of this has to do with how insurance companies create their formularies.
That's
But when we're thinking about state costs and recommendations or strategies moving forward is there, this is getting back to what Dr. Aziz was saying, is, what, is there a cost that might be anticipated being appropriate for the treatment of that disease pharmaceutically?
I think it's, I look at it as saying, if we look at, instead of looking at the drug side and then backing the disease, look at the disease side and back into the drugs. So it's saying, okay, within our state spend, which diseases are using the highest drug cost? And within that cohort of people, is there a lot of variation in the drugs that are being utilized? Because if we're seeing high cost drugs being used, low cost drugs being used, is that a place for us to start thinking about how to make it with the market?
It's a complex endeavor indeed, if you don't mind me. to
Yeah, go ahead.
interject. I think that maybe therapeutic class stratification might work well as a proxy for the diagnostic approach. I think diabetes is a great example, like the therapeutic class of a lot of diabetic drugs are anti-hyperglycemics or anti-diabetics. Whereas you have type 1 and type 2 diabetes, so get away from an indication specific pricing paradigm, maybe look at the therapeutic class, which seems deeply embedded in these price transparency frameworks. That might be sufficient enough of a proxy to use versus the diagnostic specificity.
And if you don't mind, I'm gonna ask yourself and Dr. Woodward to maybe work on something like that, because I think you can come back with us and saying, I think where the data is important is knowing where the cost factors are. So we can focus our attention on things that are costly. And not trying to go all over the board. And I think what I'm trying to get to is you can't boil, what we call it, boil the ocean, but we can identify within it key places to begin looking.
I'm happy to.
Have to do that, and you have to do that?
Yes.
Awesome, thank you. We talked about, again, the question about waste. I don't know where that is going to go, but I think it's one of the things to look at as well. Is where how much waste is there, looking at reimbursement, rounding up if you can. Again, I don't have the answers today, but just for us to begin thinking about these topics for strategies to make recommendations for people. Yeah. Are we all? Very good. I have some things here I found also about some strategies from different organizations about how to, again, reduce drug cost. Not so much trying to get to the price of the drug, but how much we're purchasing, if you will, within the state. All right, any more comments about that, Dr. Marsh or Representative Murphy or anyone else? Are we all set to move on or do we wrap this up? Okay, next meetings, next meeting's gonna be on May 1st, and I believe we have one on June. May 1st at 10 o'clock in the morning, and I think we also have another one on June 5th. At 10 o'clock in the morning. That word.
Could I ask, sort of other business?
Yeah, please.
One of the things I was good at and known for in times past was what we used to call listserv on healthcare finance. I distributed things that I thought were interesting to people who are interested in healthcare finance. One of the things that I found myself doing, and I've been kind of emailing you from time to time, things that I thought were interesting. I'd like to offer setting up a now Google group, not a listserv.
We can't do it.
Can't do it.
No, but you can send all that.
You can send it around to people.
What is the right to know? Is it sends it to you and you distribute it to the group?
Correct, I believe that's the way
Is
it
that
goes.
The way it goes?
But what we can do is we can't have a conversation, you can only have it unidirectional. You only can send the information out, you can ask for information coming back.
And whatever you send probably should be posted on our website. Just for full-
This was a question. I'm bringing it up.
It's great. I mean, it's great to have that information, but we just have to be compliant with.
Yeah,
rights and-
so to comply, it needs to be a list that is sent out, but nobody can respond.
We can't, right, we can't discuss it,
We can discuss it here.
right? We could discuss it one-on-one with you,
Yes,
but we
That's
could
why
not
when-
have a group.
that's why we
discussion.
had with yourself and Dr. Izzy. And I talked about as is. Right, as is.
Two, but not three.
Two, once I get involved, then we have three, that's a quorum.
Right.
You, two of you can talk amongst yourself about something, but
I understand. That's easy. We're doing that. Now the question is it worthwhile my setting something up? So I've got a yes and a no.
Well, yes, it's worthwhile you sharing your wisdom, what you have with the group, but it just has to be shared with everyone and then publicly postable, I believe. So that nothing is under the radar. Everything is open to the public.
I have no trouble publicly posting. Good question.
I think it's easier just to send it
Should I send it to you?
there.
then Nancy.
Nancy.
And she,
Wave her magic wand.
Yes. and she'll-
Okay.
I don't know, goes.
right. So any of us who have something that we think would be interesting to the
They do the
group,
same thing.
we would do the same thing, send it to Nancy.
The Nancy
So what
issue.
about inviting people that are interested outside of the board itself?
A little more, what do you invite people?
Just
You mean as far as talking to people that are not part of the board?
post sharing it. I thought of this as a distributing these days it's URLs instead of the actual article itself. And I wouldn't go behind paywalls, you know.
You could set up probably a listserv that's available to people at that point in time, because it becomes public to the listserv. Anybody can be part of it. As long as the listserv is not private. Listserv is open to anybody who wants to be part of it.
That's what I'm asking, yes. So would it be inappropriate? or
I'll tell you
appropriate?
what, I'm gonna turn it over to the attorney.
Okay.
If we set up a system where anybody who wants to sign up for it and receive the same information at the same time, that should be okay too. But we have to be able to provide that information to
To anybody.
the public and say, hey, would you like to sign up for this mailing list or whatever you want to call it? That should be okay.
Yes.
All
I'm
right,
done. I'm
so
gonna
we're gonna
send
let
something.
him do the research. And be sure we're all, because I want to be sure whatever we're doing is copacetic and it's compliant with 91A. And not go down a rabbit hole we shouldn't be going down.
So I'll await something from you.
Yes, I'll work on that.
And in the interim, I'll send stuff to.
That answer, then she can say. Strip it. I like that, like where you're going, just want to be sure that we don't get in that.
Totally understood.
All right. Any more business people want to talk about before we get into public comments? Okay. Attorney Bison, you've been looking to talk. Now is your time.
Well, it's good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to address you. That's all right. It just makes me feel like Thanksgiving. For the record, my name is Donald Funstein. I work at the Gallagher firm in Concord. We represent AHIP, the American Health Insurance Plans. And I don't know if we represent I don't know if we represent 100% of the commercially insured market in New Hampshire on the health insurance plan side. If not, it's certainly close to that. And I just wanted to have the record be aware that by letter dated March 30th, I wrote to the chairman and emailed, I believe, the entire board, and also Ms. Fluid, a letter on behalf of our client AHIP. And the issue deals with the issue from the first 15 minutes of your meeting today, and that would namely be the assessments. And I did hear, even though I was a little late, part of the discussion about the developments in the legislature, the question about constitutionality and those matters. And the letter actually is specifically on point. It's a request under your existing statute, 126 B, section 8, Roman 2, where in the pertinent part, it simply says that the board may waive any assessments under subparagraph C or E of that section 8, if it is in the interest of the board and the interest of the parties to be assessed. And then in the body of the letter, it's very short. And I would ask Ms. Fluid or Mrs. Fluid, whatever the case may be, to please post the letter on the website. You know that the board is very promotive of transparency, so everybody will see it. And in the letter, it talks about how the waiver would be in the interest of the board and the interest of the community to be assessed. It asks the board to exercise its jurisdiction under the existing statute, not under a statute that is to be debated, such as House Bill 1 or House Bill 2. And I just want the record to reflect that that is there. I don't believe the board has addressed it in any fashion yet today. Am I correct in that?
Believe the letter specifically, no, but I think the underlying concern, which is it's been addressed by having it sent to the Attorney General's office for advice from the Attorney General.
And the advice that you're seeking also includes this letter dated March 30th. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay. I didn't
haven't seen that
understand.
letter, so.
I didn't understand that was in the motion. That was.
The motion is to bring this forward to the Attorney General's office for them to help guide us in the decision-making process. And we talked about the thing, constitutionality piece, the waiver, the whole thing at that point in time. So it's all under this point in time, in my opinion, the Attorney General. It's for
So-
them to make the ruling and help us as a board guide us.
just so that the community to be accessed would know what to expect. Does that mean we're still issuing invoices?
No, we said in the meeting, back in the tape. When we hear from the Attorney General on May 1st, we'll make that determination.
They just
Yeah.
clarify, I mean, it's just like any interaction that you have with your client, the Attorney General is our legal counsel. And none of us, well, I'll speak only from this, I don't feel qualified, not just from your letter, but from all of the issues that are, that are determining whether or not to move forward with the fees
I think that's.
and
very-
others.
I agree with you.
We need to consult with our counsel,
Right,
with our legal counsel, and that's what we're doing. So,
so if necessary, we can renew this request after you consult with your counsel.
that's part of the consultation, is to understand whether, number one, we can do it and whether we should do it. I, for one, think we probably do want to delay issuing fees because there's so much up in the air, and that's why I use the word limbo. We don't want to have money coming in that we then have to refund. We don't want to have, we don't want to incur an expensive litigation if it can be avoided. So if we can get, but I'm just a simple country doctor. I'm not an attorney. And so I think we need to consult with our legal counsel. That's my opinion only. But that's what we decided to do by a vote of the board.
Well, I always follow the doctor's advice.
You're rare,
That would conclude my remarks. We'll
right, Bill?
renew the request if appropriate at a later time, that you can simply arrange to post it. So everyone will understand what's in there. That would be appreciated.
Could
Should I
you
post
send it
it?
to me? I never
I
got it.
have it.
Oh, okay. So I don't.
It's sort of in the left letter kind of thing, so I don't think that's probably why it
Normally,
wasn't distributed.
normally what we do is the way it's supposed, for the statutes, we post things that we're gonna review at the meeting 7 days before the meeting.
Right.
I can post it with, under the.
I guess my only comment with respect to that was,
It was filed within the 7 days, so even if we wanted to, we could post it because it wasn't there.
yeah, very good. Thank you.
May I ask a question? Should I post it for the upcoming meeting material, for the
May.
next meeting?
Yes,
Okay,
please.
I'll do that.
Thank you very much.
You have to stay within the time.
I have comments. Do you want me to sit here or wherever you want? Don warned me that seat is very low. I will try to sit up straight.
If you disappear, we'll understand.
Okay. I know you'd like me to. All right, hi, thank you for an opportunity to speak to you. There's three different categories of stuff I'd like to talk about. I've listened to your hearing. I'm Representative Jess Edwards. I'm the chairman of Division 3 Finance, therefore responsible for what we try to put into HB2 of the budget trailer bill. And as I'm listening to and because of that, I've had to read and reread your statute several times. And in general, I think your board is wanting to get outside of the scope of what's in the statute. I think if you go back and you reread the powers of your board, your interest in looking at the cost effectiveness of diagnoses, while well-intended and maybe really smart, it's not in your statutory authority. And the reason I bring that up is because y'all are supposed to submit a budget, and that happens to come through Division 3. And your budget should reflect what it is you are intending to do. And so if you're wanting to do things that are outside of your scope, then it probably ought not be in your budget. It's one of those things. And I would, as I reread it, it seems like there's an advisory council that's supposed to help you with your strategy. And your budget should reflect your strategy. And you've submitted a budget, and I don't know that you've ever convened an advisory council meeting. So you're acting without the sort of the statutory accountability and process that's implied pretty clearly in the statute, I think there's a concern about words, semantics. I know that y'all are trying to avoid the terms regulation and price, but as I hear, it's fairly clear that there's discussion about wanting to regulate the number of PBMs that service our public payers. And that may be through the influence of information, and perhaps it can be done legitimately. But I'm just saying that it seems to me like you're avoiding the word regulation while trying to be able to set up the conditions in which you have effectively regulated the market. So, and then the price versus cost issue, one party's price is another party's cost. And so I'm just seeing some semantics in there. And whenever I see government people being very cautious and careful about their semantics, I worry about the public transparency issue. It's almost like the intent is to, okay, we'll have code words and that way no one will really know what we're saying. And I don't think that's your intent, but I just want to highlight that concern. On the legislative, now I'm changing topics. On the legislative update, there's more involved than HB 130 and 172. Representative Leishman, a Democrat from Petersboro, and myself co-sponsored both of those bills. They were held up in Commerce 10-10, and the chair has decided not to put anything to the floor without a declarative vote. So that's why those are being retained. But to go back to the legislative history, some things that I think you all should appreciate in order to maintain your independent and professional judgment on what the legal status is. The statute that you're working on, when it was first introduced, it skipped Finance and Ways and Means. And so therefore, those bodies of jurisdiction never had an opportunity to weigh in. GELCAR and the rulemaking process did take a look at this, and in a bipartisan way, they unanimously determined that it was extremely unclear what the direct benefit would be to the people being assessed the fee. And so they introduced into the public record the concept that this is an unconstitutional tax and not an assessment of fees. Based on that, they recommended that the legislature look at it. And so, again, a bipartisan effort on two different amendments on HB2. Division 3 looked at it, one by Representative Waller and one by myself, again with Representative Leishman, decided that to take the issue of the unconstitutionality off the table by redirecting that we use general funds instead. And in fact, we did allocate an HB1 general funds in lieu of the fee assessment. I think I've spent a lot of time talking to Representative Lynn, and I think it might be fair to say that Representative Lynn understands that the legislature can in fact change law in HB2. We do that on any money related issue. And so if we need to, we could get a statement from Representative Lynn, because I'd like to make sure he's understood that in fact he recognizes that HB2 does have the authority and the power of changing law. And also talking to Representative Lynn about the unconstitutionality of the tax or the fee. I think he leans towards thinking it's an unconstitutional tax as well, because there's not a benefit, the direct benefit to the those being assessed. Finance passed HB2 out on a 14-11 vote. Of course, it has probably 80 things in it. So they didn't vote specifically on the PDAB issue, but PDAB was never, there have also been subsequent negotiations with the other party in order to try to navigate the budget process. And the other party did not raise the PDAB as an issue. It wasn't a negotiating point. So I don't have any reason to know that where they are on the HB2 item. I just want to say that the HB2 that I authored is addressing what I consider is that this particular board as constituted is perhaps the least accountable entity of the New Hampshire government and is probably the most powerful, because you do in fact have the ability to regulate, and if the industry does not, you regulate what data they need to provide you, and if they don't provide you that data, the statute says you can fine them. So this is basically the definition of government, where you can impose requirements on a citizenship, and if they don't do what you tell them to do, you can punish them. It becomes enforceable. So I think as constituted, the PDAB is the least accountable and most powerful entity in New Hampshire government. I think the letter from AHIP recognizes that, and they pointed out rightly, I think, that in your current statute, you have the power to waive the fee. I am on record, I think just by email, but I could do more than that, of saying that I think you ought to implement that part of the statute to waive these fees. It's in the interests of the industry being assessed, as denoted by the letter that you've received. And I think it's also in the interests of the board. At one point, you all, when I was here, had a discussion about whether or not you enjoyed immunity for your decisions and your actions. I don't know if that ever got resolved. If you do not enjoy immunity and the industry were to bring a lawsuit, I'm just concerned for your own personal and financial well-being, that you might be involved in something that you don't want to be. So waiving this is probably the best thing you can do. I agree that you should get the AG to consult with you. It is a legal issue. And then I want to give credit to Senator Sherman, Dr. Sherman, because I think he in his discussion rightly noticed the power of in the privacy world, we call it data minimization. Collect the least amount of data that you have to in order to reduce your overall exposure to a data breach. So you didn't use the term data minimization, but that's what you described. And I do appreciate your ongoing interest in looking for redundancies. And in your conversation with Dr. Aziz, I think that came out that you're looking for ways to figure out how do you get to the powers of the board without having to go reinvent the wheel in sort of the data collection area. How can we leverage redundant data in a way that the analytical framework can do the work for you? And that's really it for me. So thank you. I hope those remarks get put into the minutes. Thank you. And I'll take questions if there are any questions, or you want me to disappear now? Hey, and I'd also like this in the minutes as well. I believe in the fundamental concept of what you guys are trying to do. The power of information and knowledge can shift the market. I listened to your three ways of describing it, and that was very powerful to me. That tactically in the short run, the sentinel effect could kick in on the supply side. Just having people looking over your shoulders is unimaginably powerful in terms of the amount of discipline it can do. And then having the demand side working in conjunction with, better information and pricing and information. I think that's kind of obvious. That's your basic supply and demand. But then your long-term effects of how, that I got to go back and reread that part of the minutes, but I hadn't even thought through the implications of having these things in place over the longer term, in terms of disciplining the market. And so anyways, it was a great hearing. Thank you for letting me sit through it.
Thank you. Any more public comments? Any more discussion
I
before we
need bigger seats out here. Bob.
put it in the budget?
Yeah.
All set? Okay, motion to adjourn. Other move.
Second.
Unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you.